Hey guys, so I am here in Brooklyn at Books Are Magic, and tonight is the launch party of The Midnights by Sarah Nicole Smetana. I just read it last week and loved it. It's really great. I'll be talking about it in my wrap-up, but I hope you guys enjoy. Go check it out. Here we are, waiting for the event to start.
A really exciting debut author, Sarah Nicole Smetana. Thank you. As she officially launches her book, The Midnights. The Midnights take place in Sarah's native Southern California, a coming-of-age tale with notes of loss and coming into your own, both in life and creatively. We are really thrilled about The Midnights, so we are also thrilled to host Sarah, and thrilled again to have Amy Kurzweil, author of the graphic novel Flying Couch, here to speak with Sarah about the book. So please join me in welcoming Sarah and Amy.
So overwhelmed with how many of you are here, so thank you.
I've watched this book grow. I remember reading the very first versions of it, and it's so amazing to see it real. I just finished reading it in its full form like an hour ago, and I had to pee for like the last 70 pages, and I did not pee. So I think that's a sign that I was really wrapped in attention. It was really amazing.
So I'm reading from the end of chapter 3. It's still pretty early in the book. What's happened is Susanna, who's my main character, she is kind of pissed off because her father blew her off to hang out with these two fans who've been following him around all summer. And so she went to this party instead of waiting around for him, where she drank too much and had a romantic encounter that she feels conflicted about, and learned some things that she doesn't necessarily like, and so this takes place the next day. His thoughts were already traveling far from our conversation, and this time I didn't bother trying to reclaim them. Tossing the toast in the trash, I turned from the kitchen. As I passed behind him, he reached out and grabbed my hand. "If you could start something over," he murmured, his gaze tearing into me. "Start fresh, with what you know now. Would you do it?" A cold fear crept up my spine. "Why are you asking me this?" "Something's changing, Susie. I can feel it." His lips twisted into a smile and his grip tightened. My skin pinched beneath his fingers. I'm so close to understanding, to figuring out what I need to do to get it all back. It's all going to be different this time. I wanted so badly to believe that his words came from a place of hope, but I knew better. He was untying his tether, loosening his weight, floating away.
I've seen this book go through a lot of different changes, and I'm wondering how this book changed as you wrote it. What did you think it was about? Why did you want to write this book at first, and then what did it become as you wrote it?
Yeah, so when I started writing this book a long time ago, I think I was still in college when the first seeds of this appeared. I wanted to write about a band, and I wanted to write about the Southern California music scene because that was something that was really, that mattered a lot to me when I was a teenager. So I wanted to write about a band, and I started writing about a band, and it was really boring. It just wasn't any good, and so then I kind of started over a little bit, and I went back to this character who was my protagonist. I didn't really know who she was, and then I wrote this piece that started with graduation day, high school graduation, and I wrote that for a while, and that's what I turned in my first workshop at the new school. I turned it in, and she had a mother who was really sort of kind of awful and didn't like her, who she was, and kept trying to change her. She had this stepfather who was super weird and aloof, and and I turned it into a workshop, and people read it, and someone said, "So what happened to the dad?" And the dad wasn't in it at all. It wasn't the father left, or my father's not here. He just wasn't on the page at all. And then everyone started talking about the dad, "Oh, what happened to that?" And then the workshop got totally far away from where it was supposed to be, as happens. And I was just sitting there thinking, oh. And that's what happened. And then I spent the next 4 years trying to figure out what happened to the dad.
Okay, so speaking of the father in this book, I've noticed that a lot of coming-of-age stories feature the death of a parent, and in this book, it's not a spoiler, it's on the cover. Susanna's father dies tragically, and a lot of the book is about Susanna trying to find him again. And this is a sort of a trope in, I think, coming of age stories, that there's an absent parent, like it's in every Disney movie pretty much. So I'm wondering, how much were you thinking about that as a plot that has been explored before? What were the things you wanted to avoid in exploring that plot, and what were the things that you wanted to make sure you touched on?
I don't think there was anything necessarily that I was trying to avoid. More so, I was just trying to make sure that I wrote this authentically. That's really the thing that I was most concerned about, trying to write this grief in a way that still felt active and compelling and made for a good story that helped my protagonist grow. So really I was thinking more about that kind of stuff as opposed to what I didn't want to do. And it's funny because, yes, it's a very common trope, especially in coming-of-age stories, but it also happens to every one of us, you know, so it felt like super universal too. Something that can be talked about forever because it's going to happen to all of us if it hasn't already.
A little about Susanna's journey in terms of her parents. Do you see her as, like, in this book, moving toward her father or moving away from him?
Definitely both. In the beginning, before he dies, she's definitely trying to grasp onto him. I think she's always felt that he was kind of drifting from her, and so she spends so much time trying to pull him back in. After he dies, there's definitely this like ebbing, this tidal thing where she is straining so hard to get closer to his memory, to get closer to keep him present in her life. But as that happens and she learns certain things about him, it kind of rejiggers her understanding of him and her family and herself as well, which then pushes her further back. So I think it's definitely like a flowing wave of closer and further and closer and further, and not really sure how she feels about it. So it's mostly in her own mind and her own understanding of herself.
I mean, something really impressive about this book is that it can feature the death of a character who is like almost the most present character, even though he's not physically there. You're always aware that he's like in the room somehow, usually through music in some way. So I guess I want to ask you a few questions about music. First, I mean, do you want to tell us about your experience with music? Have you ever done anything like that? Or?
I wonder. Yes, I have. When I was in high school and in college, I played in bands. Before I wanted to be a writer, I wanted to be a musician. And so that's how I started writing, is really through writing song lyrics and writing poems that I turned into song lyrics. And so when I was in high school, I was in a band where I played guitar and I sang. And when I was in college, I was in a band when I was in college, I was in a band where I played tambourine and sang backups, which is more along the lines of what Susanna does in the story. Although my experience was totally different than hers. I loved playing tambourine and singing because it was like all the fun and none of the responsibility. I could just like show up at shows and like go on stage and like.
Did you get bruises?
Oh, for sure. You have to, yeah. The first time I like did it, my entire hand turned blue. And like if you hit it against your side, your entire side turns blue. It's very dangerous stuff, tambourine. Let me tell you.
Does anything like that happen to you with writing? Like, do you ever have those moments where did that happen with this book at all?
I mean, not in a way that's that profound. But yeah, I mean, I definitely get sudden spurts of inspiration. I think it's different in novel writing than in songwriting because songs are just like, 0.00001% of the length of a novel. So you can like have this idea of the entire song and it just like comes to you, but you can't really have that with a novel. Some people say so, but I don't believe it. So when I have like sudden spurts of inspiration, it's always like I'll get a couple lines of dialogue, or I'll get a little description. It's always like a couple sentences at most, but it happens at very inopportune times, especially when I'm trying to sleep. That's when it always happens.
I've I found in this book there was something special about the way you wove lyrics throughout. Maybe you could say a little bit about how you did that. I mean, it struck me that like if I were trying to put lyrics into a novel, it would just come off as like super cliche and lame. And every time your lyrics came up, I had this feeling like I was getting some insight.
I definitely thought about that quite a bit. So lyrics, some of them are just like she's writing in her notebook. But there's a lot of lyrics that come through in text messages as well.
Yeah.
And this was partly, I wanted to find a different way to have characters communicate via text that wasn't just like, hey, what's up? Not much you. Hang out, you know? Yeah, like my husband and I, we like send each other cat photos and emojis with effects, and like that's how we talk to each other, which would not be very fun in a book and or impossible. So I wanted to find a different way to do that, and so it seemed, and I wanted the text messages to function in a way that really said something about the character, that advanced the plot a little bit, advanced just your understanding of the world. So when I came up with that idea, it was really exciting because it was just something different.
What about the band names in the book? How did you, that's another delight in the book, is every time you get to a band name, you're just like, oh my god, that's amazing. That should be a real band. There's so many. And it's almost like, I don't know, it's almost like a very slight parody almost of like, just there's so many different bands, you know, in the scene. I have a favorite band name, but...
What is it?
Well, I want to hear yours first. Do you have a favorite from this book?
Yeah, my favorite band name is The Endless West, and that's the biggest band in the book, the one that my character is involved with. That's the last band name I actually figured out because it was so important. And I really, for that one, I really wanted it to be something that was indicative of California. I wanted the band name to sound very much be a product of place. I feel like so much of this story is like, it can't exist outside of California. If you were trying to put this story in a different place, it wouldn't exist. And that's what I wanted this band name to be as well. They're also a product of place.
My favorite band name is Pirate Idaho.
That is definitely a one-hit wonder in the book.
What happened to Pirate Idaho?
Probably on tour somewhere.
Like a behind the music about Pirate Island. Well, you just started to talk about setting. So I know that this book is really specifically California. You're from California. What about California was important for you to get into this book?
I really wanted to show some of the nuances that I didn't feel were represented a lot in the media. I think now there's a ton of like California books especially that are doing really cool things. There's a lot more TV. But when I was a teenager, when I was like 14 or 15 or something, that's when like the OC came out, you know? Quickly followed by the Laguna Beach and the Real Housewives of Orange County. And all of these TV shows that like the outside world, outside of California, Southern California loved, showed this like tiny sliver of Southern California, Orange County in particular, and I felt like it gave it such a bad rap because it was always just like this one little sliver of the county. And that was not my experience. That was not how I grew up. You know, I didn't, live in this mansion and be at the beach every day, and it wasn't always sunny. So that was another thing. I wanted to show a different, like, slice of California, of Orange County in particular, and I also really wanted to explore different weather because it wasn't always sunny. It's like people who aren't from California, haven't spent a lot of time there, always think of it as like, that opening scene in La La Land, where it's like another day of sun, and they're like dancing on the cars in the freeway. It's not like that. The freeway is miserable. But also there's more than just sun, and there's, you have these droughts that go on forever, and then a fire will like burn the entire state to the ground, which we've seen recently, and then you'll have a lot of rain, and because there's no brush, you'll have mudslides, which knock the state to the ground, and so there's just so much more, and I really wanted to explore all of that setting. I wanted to explore all that weather, and how it affects the people who live there.
Do you want to say anything about how setting worked from a craft perspective in your book? Something I noticed is the threat, especially of weather, of fire, of wind, felt almost like this foil for other tensions in the book. But sometimes it was the tension in the book. how were you? I mean, how did you do that? That was so cool. Like, how can I
Editing.
steal that technique?
Lots and lots of editing. Yeah. I just think that's one of those things that you have to like build in over draft and draft and draft and refine. But I knew I always wanted to do that from the beginning. So it was like a very clear thing I was trying to achieve.
About the setting, there's a moment where Susanna says her boss is like trying to make her feel like happy about life. She works in a coffee shop in the
Like Another Day of Sun.
Yeah, he's like that California parody. She says to him, "You can't see anything in the wind," and that moment was like, I felt like it was foreshadowing this way in which like the characters are kind of at the mercy of California, like at the mercy of the natural disaster.
Well, that's the funny thing about California, right? My California friends in here, it's like there's so much disaster that can happen, and yet everyone is flocking there. You know, it's like, I mean, I guess natural disaster can happen anywhere, but like, especially in recent years, it's been so much more obvious in California because of climate change and everything, but it's like, you move there and you think of the sunshine and you forget that all this other stuff can happen. And that's kind of one of the funny things about California too, is the resilience, I think, of the people who live there. It's like my parents, even just a couple months ago with all those brush fires, it came, very close to their house again. I remember when I was a kid, it came pretty close. And it's just every time it's like, oh, it didn't hit us. Then we forget. And it's like the winds come and they knock down your fences and they destroy your yard and you clean it up and then you don't think about it until the next year when the wind inevitably comes. Yeah. So
it's also like her father is parallel to that landscape. Like you don't know what's going to happen. It's similar with her father, and that's why I thought it was so beautiful the way those things paralleled each other. Was that on purpose?
That was definitely on purpose. In earlier drafts, it was even more overt. I had the father very clearly like stating that he was affected, or not him stating, but Susanna stating clearly that her father his moods changed depending on the weather, and it was very overt. So that's something that was fixed in editing.
Yeah.
Make more nuanced.
More subtle, yeah. I also want to ask you about the setting in time. You somehow managed to set this in time such that I feel like any generation could read it and feel like it was about their adolescence. And I don't know how you did that because especially the way technology works, like we're all acquainted with such different technologies. And so how did that evolve as you wrote it?
Didn't. Although I will admit that for like the first couple of drafts there were like no phones and no computers and so I think that's just like the amateur writers like not sure how to deal with technology yet, especially because the generation we're from, we didn't necessarily grow up with it, so it's slightly different than teens now who have only experienced technology. I think part of it is just thanks to classic rock. I mean, I feel like classic rock music will never go out of fashion because it's like such a pinnacle of rock and roll. I think the music I listened to as a teenager is definitely out of fashion. Having that be the music that my character really responds to is something that makes it feel sort of timeless because I feel like all generations are going to love classic rock. They might not all love the same emo bands I did, but they will probably love the Beatles. So,
do you love classic rock?
I do. I didn't really start getting super into it until college, though.
Okay.
But yeah, I think part of my bio is that I like pilfered my parents' best records, which is absolutely true.
No more emo then.
Forever.
Emo forever?
Forever. I mean, what a silly question.
There's a theme in the novel of intoxication. Sometimes it's as I go on.
She could not have timed that any better.
Can I have a sip of wine while I There's a lot of alcohol in the book, and different characters have different relationships to alcohol. It's to be expected in a music scene, I think. And there's a moment when Susanna meets this group of new friends, and she has a bunch of beer with her. And she says she walks into the room with a bunch of beer, and the guys are looking at her as if she held a holy elixir in her hands. She's like, all of that power in my small, soft hands. Alcohol is this power. And so I'm wondering about how much you thought about the role alcohol or potentially other forms of intoxication would play a role in this story?
I don't think I thought too much about alcohol specifically. It was more just this, like, the different ways, the different kinds of currency you can have. That's really what I was thinking about with that. Money was not really the currency that mattered to this group of friends. It was more, you know, what can they bring? Can they get you? Can they sneak you into the show? Can they bring you a block of beer? Can they, you know, it was like all these different ways that you can make someone indebted to you, and money was not part of that. Because, you know, they're teenagers. They have maybe part-time jobs, maybe not. They don't have a lot of money, so.
That's really interesting, especially that, like, the currency would be something that maybe is not, like, the healthiest and best thing for them.
As teenagers do.
Yeah, as teenagers and adults.
True.
So that makes me want to ask you about the friendships in the story. You were recently on a panel where you were talking about female friendship, and one of the words used to describe the potential for toxic relationships being intoxicants. I don't really like that word. I don't know if you like that word, toxic relationship, but I'm wondering how you would describe Susanna's relationship with her new best friend.
With the word toxic friendship, I feel like destructive is a better word, because when I think of, like, what is a toxic friendship, it's these two people who are terrible for each other, and they're, you know, destroying each other, but they're completely, like, insulated from the outside world, and they can't escape each other. They're all that they have, and so it's just, like, imploding further and further. And that's what I think of when I think of these type of friendships. Although I think Susanna and Lynn's is maybe slightly different. There is that, but I feel like it's mostly Susanna imploding on her own. I don't think Lynn is, like, forcing her to implode or pushing her in that direction. She's kind of, like, doing it to herself. So I would not call them a toxic friendship per se. I think it starts off very intoxicating, and then it's just the foundation is lies, pretty much. So, you know, only so much can continue going until some of those lies begin to surface.
I don't think we meet people who seduce us into some, even as young people, like, we don't get seduced into some terrible situation that we aren't seeking out. And I think
Yeah, like, even with people who talk about toxic friendships, it wasn't always, otherwise you wouldn't be in it. There's something that really draws you to that, and usually it's a want or a desire within yourself.
Yeah.
You're not like, it's not like, hey kid, get in the back of this car, you know? It's like you want to seek out this thing that's, like, dangerous and exciting, and that's definitely something Susanna is doing.
Yeah, I mean, it felt like an empowering portrait of a young person who maybe wants things that aren't good for her, but it's not, you know, she's not a victim. Like, she's a character who does some troubling things.
She makes some mistakes.
Yeah, she makes some mistakes. The sharp joy of a crush. She's, like, has all these crushes, and it's, like, one of the most pleasurable things about this book. How did you write about teenage romance without falling into, you know, cliches, and how did you approach that task?
Yeah, well, that was something I knew from very early on. I didn't want to write a story that was about soulmates, first of all, or finding the one, which I think a lot of, you know, teen books are, and that's totally fine. I think those stories are valid. I enjoy them very much as well, but that's not what I wanted to do with this book. And I think that's because it's a story about her finding herself, and so that's kind of a separate thing from the romance. But there are quite a few romances. And I think that, again, is drawn from my own teenagehood, from something that I didn't see a lot of in books, was just this okayness with having crushes on a lot of people and trying a lot of relationships. I think that's a normal thing to do when you're a teenager, and I think it's healthy, and I think we should have more literature that shows that. Like, you don't always have to have this, like, huge relationship. A lot of times what we have are just things, and we don't know what they are, and they don't last, and that's okay. And so I always wanted to write about those things, because that's a lot of what my teenagehood was like, those things, and not just, like, finding the one. And for my friends out there who have read the book and know what happens at the end romantically, that I always knew from the very, very beginning. I always knew I wanted that ending to be that way. And I'm being cryptic on purpose, so you have to read the book. But also because no spoilers. But that was one thing that was really important to me, is that the ending happening the way it happened. I always knew that from the beginning. And I knew very little from the beginning, so yeah.
when I met you, you were a fiction student at the New School and writing this book, and this struck me as much as an adult book, as a young adult book, as any of the other things that people were writing that featured young characters. So what do you think makes this a book for young people? Why do you think it was marketed that way? And did you have to make any changes in order to accommodate that market?
Yeah, this is such an interesting question. I thought for the longest time that I was writing an adult book just because that's what I knew. I think I didn't have a lot of experience with young adult books. When I first started writing this, all of my favorite books were adult books about teenagers. So like, I don't know, it made sense to me. I always read about teenagers, I always wanted to write about teenagers, and that's just what I knew. After I signed with my agent, she started steering me in the proper direction. That's when it started clicking in my head that this could be a young adult book, and really the only thing that changed was perspective. When I was at the New School, when I thought I was writing an adult book, I also thought I had this narrator who was looking back from like later in life. And so there was this wide gap of distance between where she was and the actual events of the story. There was this really wide gap, and I was really, really interested in that at the time. I thought it would be so interesting to like explore this idea of memory and this unreliable narrator and how it parallels like her father and his unreliable memory, and there was like all this cool stuff I really wanted to do. And then I wrote the book and none of that stuff happened. And so I think that's kind of how it ended up moving toward young adult, because that perspective by the end of writing the book didn't exist anymore. And so now the perspective is much, much closer. And so really, I didn't have to change anything. You know, the story doesn't have to change, the language didn't have to change. Like, young adult books are really smart. Right now, they're so awesome, and there's like this huge just wealth of wonderful stories in young adult, and so nothing really had to change. Like, you don't have to do anything to like make it young adult except be aware of the perspective that your narrator is telling the story from. That's really all it was for me.
There's like this slightly older narrator. She's like 6 months, a year, right, older than the person living these experiences, basically. Is that right?
Sort of, but
Sort of.
Spoilers, so.
Oh, yeah. No spoilers.
But it's past tense, so it's not, she's
Yeah.
not telling it from the moment. There is like a little bit of,
Yeah, there's
Yeah.
a little bit of distance from like the narrator and the person. Do you think that Susanna as an older person has advice for Susanna as a younger person?
yeah. I think she would just, like, if she were to tell like herself at the beginning of the story advice, I think she would just tell her younger self that you'll get through it. I think it really comes down to that. I don't think she would say anything that would change the actions, change what had happened. Because we need to have those mistakes. We need to have those trying experiences. We need to go through all of that to become the person we are on the other side. I needed to have all my silly teenage mistakes to become the person that I am now. And I'm, you know, would I have liked to do some things different when I was a teenager? Sure. But I don't regret it, because I'm very happy with like where I've come to. And so I think that's really what she would say. It's just, you'll survive, you know, you'll get through it. It gets better. It gets better. And you're not stuck. You're not stuck. I feel like when we're teenagers and we're in high school, we feel like we're stuck sometimes. And like, we forget that there's an entire world. And so that's, I think, why college is often so much this like holy point we're trying to get to her, to.
Does slightly older Sarah have any advice for slightly younger Sarah who started this book however many years ago?
You'll get through it.